We all, as business owners, burn out our email lists or our personal networks or our social media following. So going on podcasts gives you that opportunity to reach a whole new audience of people. Ultimately, podcast pitching is important because it maintains that engine of getting you in front of new audiences, which can then either help you drive people back to your podcast or make them aware of your business, your products, your services, whatever.
Welcome to another episode of Listeners to Leads, where I'm helping podcasters launch and maintain a lead generating show. I'm your host, Alicia Galati, the CEO and head podcast strategist behind Galati Media, a full-service podcast management company. On this show, you'll hear my guests and I discuss everything it takes to launch a successful podcast and keep it running. If you're ready to get leads, land speaking gigs, and create deeper connections with your audience through your podcast, then this is the show for you. Today on the podcast, we have Julie Fry. Julie is such an incredible human being. Today, we're talking about using podcast guesting to attract new clients. So we're talking why it's important, the do's and don'ts of podcast pitching, tracking those guest appearances, and how to take those guest appearances a step further than just the audience and the listeners. You're going to want to listen through the end. Julie gives great tips, tricks, and strategies that you can implement DIY, or you can hire out to Julie's team or someone else to help support you with your podcast pitching. All right, join me in welcoming Julie Fry to the podcast. Hello, Julie. I am so excited to have you on the podcast. If you could just start by telling everyone who you are, what you do, and about your podcast.
Hi, Alicia. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm delighted. So I am the founder of Your Expert Guest. We are a podcast pitching and booking agency for female founders and folks that lead impact-driven businesses. So businesses in the business of doing good. And then I also host a podcast of the same name called Your Expert Guest, really designed to help people thinking about podcast guesting with what they need to know to do, what they need to do before, during, and after the podcast interview to maximize their success.
Oh, I love that. Okay. I want to pull something out of that before we even get into all of the other stuff.
Nice.
Because I talk about this a lot of using your podcast for more than just using it to attract new clients or to get new clients in, but using it as supplemental content for current clients. And so what you just laid out is this could be very easily supplemental content for the clients that you're working with now. Hey, you're about to be on this podcast. Here are our quick tips to do with that. But if you want more, here's an episode where I talk through all of this, or here's a transcript, or here's the blog post. You've already created that content, and it's such an easy way to just listen to the episode. And I don't think it gets used. That strategy doesn't get used enough. And it's one of my favorite.
Well, that is exactly why I created that podcast, because I found that during the onboarding process with our clients, I was saying the same things over and over and over, and there's a lot to it, right? Mm-hmm. So I thought, you know what? I keep saying these things. I'm going to take them all, put them into a podcast, and then give it to our new clients as they're onboarding with us. So I don't sound like a broken record.
Yes. And I'm sure it saves some of your sanity as well, being did I tell this person this thing, or I told this other person this thing? No, everybody gets the same thing. Everybody hears the same thing. And you know that you've covered all of the bases. All right. Getting into podcast pitching, we've talked about this very generally on the show before and have had people on where, we've shared horror stories of getting pitches as podcasters. And so as someone who does this professionally, number one, why is podcast pitching so important in attracting new clients? So obviously this is the Listeners to Leads show. We want you to use your podcast to generate leads, but you can't always do that when you've tapped out your current audience. So why is podcast pitching a great way to attract those new clients?
Yeah. So, and I'm sure you tell your clients this, Alicia, that It's important from the perspective of getting in front of new audiences.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of our clients, well, I would say right now it's most of them have podcasts, but when we first started, most of our clients did not have podcasts. And so they were using podcast pitching and guesting as a way to establish their thought leadership, refine their messaging, really kind of through trial and error, determine what do they want to be known for, and then get in front of people that don't already know them. Because we all as business owners like burn out our email lists or our personal networks or our social media following. So going on podcasts gives you that opportunity to reach a whole new audience of people. And then what often happens is they fall in love with the medium and the platform. I'm an ambivert, so I go both ways, but I know for introverts, they love this medium. It gives you the opportunity to have a conversation with one person. You don't have to jockey in a room full of people to get attention, and it's just comfortable. It's marketing without marketing. So ultimately, podcast pitching is important because it maintains that engine of getting you in front of new audiences, which can then either help you drive people back to your podcast or make them aware of your business, your products, your services, whatever.
Yeah, I can think back to when I first landed in the online space and started listening to podcasts, and I would hear a guest on a show and immediately go follow them on Instagram or go follow them because I loved their energy. I loved the things that they were talking about. I thought they were interesting. And sometimes I would purchase from them directly just because I was like, ooh, I like them. I like their vibe. I'm going to buy their, digital product or whatever. So I think that it is such a great way to get in front of new people and land those clients directly, even if you don't already have a podcast. So for the people who are listening, who are maybe at that beginning phase or they're thinking about having a podcast and are like, well, is this really going to work? It does. It really does. And for those of you who are podcasters and you have come to the point where maybe your downloads are stagnant and you're not really seeing that growth that you would like to see, podcast pitching is a great way to get yourself in front of those new audiences. So as I said, we had quite a few stories and horror stories of pitches that people have gotten as podcasters and podcast hosts. I can think of one that I recently got where the person said, first they emailed me, which if you go to my website, there's a link there. It says be a guest. You can fill out the form, which is what Julie did when she pitched her clients to my podcast. Like, it's not that hard to kind of figure out. And this person sent me an email and they said, hello, sir.
Oh, no.
I'm not a sir. I'm not. It's just like,
it's pretty easy to figure that out if you go to the website or listen to the podcast.
Or go to my Instagram. My pronouns are there. Like, it's all right there for you guys. So that was interesting. And then I had someone actually slide in my DMs recently to pitch me their client. And I was like, first of all, like, you're a PR firm. Why are you in my DMs? Like, come on. Also, the person sounds like they might be a good fit for my show. Mm-hmm. Fill out the form. That's all you have to do.
I know. It's not hard.
It's not. So what are some of those do's and don'ts of podcast pitching for those DIYers who are like, I want to pitch myself to be on a show, but I'm a little nervous because of these horror stories I've heard. I don't want to be that person. What do they need to do? You put your heart and your soul into your show. And I want to help you reach all of those potential listeners out there. That's why I'm excited to announce my upcoming podcast marketing workshop. It's about giving you practical tools to grow your audience. You'll learn the secrets to getting your podcast discovered, attracting your dream listeners, and boosting those download numbers. This workshop will be hosted live with a replay available on April 30th. You can sign up by going to galatimedia.com/workshop. Let's grow our podcasts together.
So yeah, I'd like to start with, because I am super sensitive to the people that worry that they're not expert enough or feel like they're not expert enough, or they feel like they're going to be pestering a host if they pitch themselves. So for those of you that this is new for you, just know that if a host has an interview format show, like they're always looking for good guests. And you want to be respectful and follow their processes. So a couple of things that we always recommend is listen to the podcast. So if there's a show that you've come across, like maybe you're on social media and you see a competitor of yours was just on a show and you're like, ooh, that show looks like it might be a good fit for me. Listen to it and check it out. See if you feel like you would vibe with the host. Would you want to have a 30-minute conversation with them? If you don't, then don't bother pitching, because chances are the interview will be like super bland and there won't be any energy between you and the host, and people aren't going to be engaged. So check for fit with the host, values alignment. Do they have guests? You'd be amazed. My show doesn't have guests and I still get pitched for that. So that's number one. Number two is, as Alicia mentioned, go to the website, because you want to get a sense of what does the host do? Are they a competitor to you? Because if they are, chances are maybe that's not the best fit for you. But if they're in a complementary industry, or even better yet, they're your ideal client, then chances are that's going to be a really good show for you. But check their About Me section so that you know what they do, learn a little bit about them personally, so you can pull that any connection points into your pitch. Make note of, do they have an application on their website? They put that there for a reason. They have a workflow, and show them respect by going through their workflow. So those are two big ones right there. Getting a little bit more detailed about the pitch itself. The host always wants to know, like, how are you going to show up and either inform or educate or inspire their audience? So when you're writing the pitch, make it about them and their listeners, and a little less about you. You do need to obviously show why you'd be a great guest, and you can do that through your credentials, maybe showcase an episode of a similar show that you've been on. So show why you're good, but make the bulk of the pitch about like how you're going to help their audience.
Oh, those are all so good. I also like that you start off with listening. Just listen to this show.
Yeah. Listeners to leads.
Yes. Listen to it. I also have seen a bit of a trend as we kind of go. We're recording this in 2022 to go live in 2023. As we kind of go into this new year, I'm seeing a shift in the quality of podcasts. And so listening to a show is going to let you know, one, is the audio quality something that you're going to feel comfortable sharing with your audience, where you know that you're going to be able to show up best and not show up as like fumbling through your words or like, wait a minute, what was I saying? Like, you want to show up awesome for these people's audience, but you also want to make sure that they have their things handled on the back end, that when they do present it, it's going to show up as your best self. And so that's where I think listening is going to give, I mean, you don't even have to listen to a whole episode, guys. Literally, you can spot check it and get an idea of the type of content it is. My lead editor recently said that she was listening to a podcast, and in the middle of an ad, like a verbal ad where the person was talking, they double sentenced something. So they said a sentence and then they were like, okay. And then said the sentence again, didn't take it out. Like, that's not a show that I'm going to want to be on. Because I know that for the way that I work personally, I need to have all my ducks in a row in my brain. And if they're not, then I'm going to fumble through my words, which is why I love my editor. Because she can help make me sound fantastic. She can help make my guests sound fantastic. And that's really important to me. But if that's not important to you and you're like, look, I just want to test this out, like Julie mentioned, using the podcast guesting as a way to test out your messaging, to get clearer on that messaging, decide, is this a direction that I really want my business to go in? Then don't worry so much about the quality, but still listen to the show, please. Please, please, please.
Yeah, you make a really good point about the audio quality because I have heard shows before where either they're doing the editing themselves or maybe they have a new editor that hasn't quite figured out the process yet. But yeah, where you hear those foo bars and you're like, oh, I don't know that I necessarily want to have my brand associated with that. So that is definitely something to pay attention to.
Yeah, and it's not that you can't do some type of collaboration with those types of people, right? Like they could be a really good fit, but the podcast is just like, ugh. So maybe you do an Instagram live with them or some type of other collaboration together where you can get in their spheres. There are obviously other ways that you can do it outside of the podcast pitching space. Mm-hmm. Are there any other do's or don'ts that you want to cover before we move on?
Just the importance of doing your research. And it is honestly the most time intensive piece if you're doing it right. And you can go down a huge rabbit hole. There are so many podcast databases like Listen Notes, and of course the podcast platforms that you listen to, Chartable. So I set a timer and our team sets a timer. So when we're working on a specific client, and they'll set a timer for 30 minutes. And in that 30 minutes, they use that time to go. We use a proprietary software to find shows that might be a good fit for that client. And then once they come up with that list, then go back and listen, to the shows to make sure that they're a good fit. So yeah, take the time to do your research. And we just put a new offer in place to help people that are doing the research. And once they see how time consuming it is, so we offer a list for them that's your custom pitch list. And it will help them see, oh, like these are the right shows for me. Here's the contact information, or here's how I apply. So it's a great way for them to kind of like, okay, I don't want to spend my time doing that. I will spend my time doing the pitching, and here's this great list I can use.
Yes. Oh, that's so good and important, especially for people who are like, look, I want the pitch to come from me, or it might feel more personal coming from me. I don't want to hire an agency like yours to do it. But that research does take so much time. I feel like there's so many things about podcasting that people don't realize how much time and effort it actually takes.
Yes.
We set timers for the market research because we put in about 4 hours of market research time when we're launching a podcast. I'm like, who are your competitors? Are they still going? What are some topics that you can talk about? Who is your audience? Who are these people? Where are they hanging? Like, there's a lot that goes into it, and people miss that stuff. Usually they're like, woo, podcast, let's go. No.
I want one too.
I'm like, yes, and please, yes, and this. I'm curious how you feel about this. So before I built the agency up to what it is now on the podcast management and strategy side, I did offer pitching as a test to see if it was something that I'd be interested in doing. I knew how to pitch. I knew how to do the research. I do not like it. And so we stopped offering it because I hate it. I am someone who I need control over all of the elements. I need control over the results. And if I can control the elements and how it goes in, then I can control the output. But pitching is something that you cannot control the output. How do you suggest someone like me who's like, I sent 50 pitches, I've gotten some back, but I keep following up with this one person, or how many times should I follow up with this person without being a nag? And there's a lot of different factors that go into it that it can feel a little overwhelming for the type A's and Enneagram ones.
And yeah, high achievers. That's such a great question. And kudos to you for experimenting. And, because podcast management and podcast pitching, they're very complementary and it makes sense. And if you don't like doing it, it's going to be harder for you to attract team members that like doing it and are excited about it. So good for you for saying like, okay, this is not for me. We're just going to focus on this is what we excel at. And we're going to do podcast management and launches. There are a lot of people out there because there are a few key skill sets that I think go into making a great podcast pitch success story. So number one is being detail oriented. So you need to be willing to put in the time of the research, noticing how the person wants to be pitched. Is this a good fit show? And then you also need to you don't have to be a great writer, but you need to be able to write from the perspective of the reader. And that's harder for some people to do. There are a lot of companies that offer like pitch templates, and I've seen a lot of them. And if you personalize it, which you're going to want to do for every single show, you can make it work. The less templatey, the better. And they don't have to be long. Like they can literally be 3 paragraphs. What's the connection point to you and the show? Why would you be a good fit for the show? And what do you think would be helpful to the host's listeners? And that's it. Bonus points if you're going to tell them like how you're going to support the episode once it goes live. So, you need to at least enjoy the process of writing somewhat. So in terms of the outcomes, so that is a tricky one. And we have learned as an agency, if we don't feel like we can get the client on at least 30% of the shows that we pitch them to, then we're not the right fit for them, or they're not the right fit for us. So we aim to convert 30 to 50% of the pitches that we send for our clients. So I think that that's a great benchmark. Like if you're doing it yourself, I've heard statistics more in the realm of like 15% if you're doing it yourself, that would be a good goal to strive for. So if you're sending out, math time, if you're sending out 10 pitches, that would be like 1.5 yeses. So aim for 2 yeses out of every 10 that you send out. That would be great. In terms of following up, so this is kind of that sales skill of being pleasantly persistent. I come from a business development background, so it is second nature to me. Like it doesn't bother me to get ghosted or to hear a no. But for a lot of people, they take it personally. So this is where I suggest a mindset shift and just come from that perspective of, hey, I am helping out. If a host says yes to me, I'm offering them a valuable, service by coming onto their show. And if they say no or they don't respond, then it might be one of a few things like I'm not the right fit for their audience. They're booked up for guests for the near future. They're changing their format to that they don't do guests anymore. Or they're just busy because like they're running their business and they're doing their show and they're managing their email inbox and stuff gets missed. So you'll want to follow up if you don't hear anything back. We suggest like 3 times. So your initial pitch, a follow up about 2 weeks after that initial pitch if you don't hear anything, and then another 2 weeks after that. And yeah, sometimes they'll say like, oh, check back with me in say 6 months. Then, make yourself a note to check back in 6 months. We suggest using some sort of tracking system, whether it's Trello or ClickUp. We use ClickUp or a good old fashioned Excel spreadsheet, but come up with a system that works for you so that you can see when you sent pitches and you know when to follow up.
Oh, that's so good. And so my brain works really well when I take the emotion out of it and like a to-do list and data and stats. That helps me to be able to take myself out of it. Like
that's your analyst brain kicking in, right?
Like it's not an affront to me. They literally are busy. And I know that. Yeah. And I'm still like, but I could do great things for you. You don't understand, So having that to-do list, which I actually have my executive assistant creating one right now of pitching 2 places and making sure that the automations in ClickUp are all set up to work the way my brain works. And if I can check it off as like, okay, I sent 5 pitches. I know that I can follow up with those people in this amount of time. Great. Checked off my list. And then when that due date comes up, I get a reminder, okay, I need to follow up with these people. And it's not as like, oh, I got to follow up with these people and there's a lot of weird energy here. It's nope, it's on my list. It's something I need to do and it's done. And it just kind of takes that out of it for me. So I like that whole tracking thing, as well as the 15 to 20%. In my brain, I'm thinking, oh, that's terrible. But if that's the industry standard, sure, that's great. Yeah. Let's just go with the industry standard. I'm over here thinking I need to land 75% of these pitches, because I'm awesome.
Yeah. And if that happens and you blow past the 15%, then that feels really good. And then it gives you that positive feedback to keep going.
And it also probably means that you're reaching too low. So I'm gonna put that there too for the listeners.
Put that right there. Yeah, you mentioned something really important where putting some sort of constraint on it. So like putting it on your calendar for an hour on Wednesday afternoon. And when you see that come up, you're like, okay, this is my hour to do my podcast pitching follow-up. Then it's just another task on your list. And then you get it done and you can move on to the next thing.
Yes. Oh, so good. How is it best to track those guest appearances? So obviously we want to be able to, I love data so much. And I'm always talking about using your statistics on your podcast to make better decisions. So how can we track those guest appearances once we have done our thing? We've sent that awesome pitch. The person has said yes. We've been on their show. And we want to make sure that we're tracking any type of leads coming from that show to our show or into our bank account. What does that kind of tracking look like on your end for you? That way we can kind of see how it might work for the DIYer.
Yeah. You'll definitely want to have, again, some sort of tool, whether it's Airtable or Excel, where you keep your live podcast appearances. Along with that, we suggest keeping what the topic was that you talked about. Additional data points that might be helpful is what's the occupation of the host of that podcast? Because if you start to see a trend where, like, let's say you're a business coach and you're going on shows in a lot of different categories, but you're seeing a trend where when you go on shows that are hosted by bookkeepers, you're seeing a higher number of leads or discovery calls or sales, then that's telling you should do more of that. So maybe just sticking with financial services folks for shows that you go on. So those are a few data points that we suggest having in your tracking tool. And you spoke to, like, you want to track the number of discovery calls, if that's an entry point into your business, number of opt-ins. So there's kind of two schools of thought there. Some people have just the same opt-in for everybody on every show. They don't customize it. So that makes it a little bit trickier to know which shows generated what. So at the very least, we suggest having a field in that opt-in form, like, how did you hear about us? The other side of that is to use some sort of link customizer like Pretty Links to customize your opt-in for each show, so that then you can track back number of opt-ins for each podcast appearance. So we've got opt-ins, we've got discovery calls, we've got sales. So those are the main things that we suggest tracking. And as I mentioned, looking at the topics, looking at the host occupation, and looking at the types of shows that you went on, so that you can start to see trends. And I suggest evaluating those every quarter, like checking in on that, reviewing the data once a quarter.
Yeah, I love that. I recently had a client where they were a guest on a show that was really, really aligned with them, and saw, I want to say it was a 150% increase in their downloads. Like, she was already getting a great amount of downloads, but it was like, these people were her people. Like, these were them. And so what we were tracking on our end was, what was that increase in downloads? What did that look like? And then once we saw that huge influx, where did it kind of land on steady increased listeners? So making sure that it's like, yes, they like you and they stayed, right? How many people stayed?
Yeah.
And tracking those kinds of things. And I do like the idea, because podcasts are evergreen and people will go back and binge listen to, tens of hundreds of podcast episodes, to have those pretty links. I really like that idea, using that as a way to track those no matter what time it is, since they will be evergreen and you'll have people find you from podcasts that you were on years ago. So making sure that you're using that.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought up podcasts, and in terms of, just the listeners and seeing how that impacts, your downloads. So if you start to see like, oh, wow, this particular type of show is bumping up my listeners. Like, I have a good friend of ours who, she has a podcast in the parenting space, and she's been guesting on, I want to say, like 4 shows a month. And yeah, she's seen like a 50% bump in her podcast downloads as a result of that. So it's a great strategy, and paying attention to like, okay, what specifically is driving that is going to help inform your decisions moving forward.
Yeah, for sure. Before we hopped on and started recording, we also talked a little bit about using podcast guesting to drive referrals. So obviously, not everyone who listens to your guest appearance will be an ideal client, but they might vibe with you really well and might be able to drive those referrals. What does that kind of look like that you've been able to see?
Yeah. And so this would be one of the strategies that I'd encourage listeners to use when they're pitching themselves to shows or if they're thinking about it, is if the host is in a complementary industry. So kind of going back to that, like, let's say you're a business coach and you know that the best referral partners for you are folks in the financial space, like bookkeepers, CPAs. Those would be great shows for you to pitch to. And let's say you have a referral program in your business. So we do have a client who she has an affiliate program. And whenever it makes sense, she always like in the green room after the recording, she'll tell the host about that when they're chatting about their businesses and how they can support each other. She'll make that available to the host. And she's got a long list of hosts that are affiliate programs because they're referring people to her firm's services. So that would be something to kind of be on the lookout for when you're pitching and guesting on shows, is how can you and the host support each other's businesses? And if you have an affiliate program, or even if you're just looking for straight referrals, that can be a great way to kind of get your business top of mind so that the host is sending people your way as it's appropriate.
The connection in podcast guesting isn't always just for the listeners. Yes, it's important and you want to make sure that you're there for the listeners, but creating those connections with those hosts, I think, can be overlooked because so often it's like, it almost feels very transactional, right? Like, I'm here to serve you, here you go, and then I'm gone. But you can take that connection so much further than just that one interview.
Yeah. And that's something where I feel like we have kind of a polarized viewpoint compared to other agencies, because there are agencies that will say, we will book you on 2 shows a month. And we don't do that. We price based on the number of pitches because it's about the relationship that you build with the host. Like, I fully intend to stay until, I think I've sent you like, oh, hey, this might be of interest to you. And, I want to have a long-term relationship with the hosts that we book our clients on and that I go on their shows, because you never know where that might lead. The first podcast I was on in 2014 was Natalie Ekdahl's Biz Chicks show. So I was like guest number 13 or something like that, right when she
probably
first started
listened
it.
to your episode then.
I've been on 3 times total, but that show, when I track back what it all led to, a friendship with Natalie Ekdahl. I had a different business at that time, and she was the keynote of my conference. Her company sponsored it in a different year, and it drove memberships and sponsorships of my community. Like, it was a very financially beneficial relationship, and we become friends, and I really value that relationship with her. So it's just amazing, like, what one podcast interview can do for you and your business.
Yes. Oh, I love that. What a great note to end on.
I know, right?
Perfect. So if you could tell everyone where they can find you, hang out with you, if you have anything that, I know you mentioned that service, that research service, I feel like that would be a great fit for people who are like, yes, I want to try to do this, but it feels like a lot of work. If you could tell a little bit about that as well.
Yeah. So our website is Your Expert Guest. We do have a free gift for listeners where we have the best guest ever podcast guesting checklist. So it tells you what to do before, during, and after your podcast interview to have the host say like, oh, I'd love to have you back, or refer you to other shows. So you can get that at yourexpertguest.com/checklist. And then socially, I'm most on LinkedIn. So you can find me at Your Expert Guest there, the corporate side, or Julie Fry, I think. I'll get you the actual right link for that. I'm sure you have it.
Yes.
And then, if you go to our website, you can see under the Work With Us tab a bit more information about both our done for you pitching services, as well as the Your Custom Pitch List offering for doing the research.
Perfect. And we'll make sure that we have links for all of that in the show notes for anyone who is driving or wants to come back to this later and get those links. Thank you so much, Julie. This was so incredible.
Thank you so much, Alicia. It was great. I loved chatting with you about all of this.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Listeners to Leads. If you found something in this episode valuable, I would really appreciate it if you shared it with a friend who you know would also get value from it. Want to send me a message? My favorite place to hang out is Instagram. You can find me at alicia.galati. Let me know what your favorite takeaway was from the episode. And don't forget, turning those listeners into leads is actually easy.